Floor for questions, but before that, there are 2 wireless mics. And before you ask your question, we'd like to request that you wait until you get a microphone. We are recording an audio and video of this event, so we want to make sure we capture your questions clearly. Okay, so when you ask your questions, could I also ask you to state your name and your organizational affiliation? Ian.
Hi, Ian Wilhelm with Chronicle Philanthropy. Aaron, in terms of the data that you produce for this, I think the most, when you mentioned the $1 out of $3 goes to underserved communities, how are you defining that grant making? For example, would grants to AIDS vaccine research, would that be part of that? Or would a grant to Teach for America be part of that? How are you defining underserved grant making in underserved areas?
We use, that's a great question, Ian. We use the data that is available to us, and that's the Foundation Center database, where they code grants of about 1,200 of the nation's largest foundations by intended beneficiary. And we used a 3-year rolling average to calculate that, or a 3-year average, rather, for 2004, 2005, 2006, so that we could eliminate influential outliers that might occur in any given year. And we identified 11 of the intended beneficiary groups that they track as marginalized in some way. And so any grant that they coded as benefiting one of those communities was counted in creating that figure. Are there some grants that get made that benefit marginalized communities that don't get coded that way? Of course there are. But it's the best available data that we have, and we think it's a reasonably accurate measure of what's happening in the sector today.
Okay. Mark Schmidt.
Thank you, Mark Schmidt with the American Prospect and former philanthropoid. I always enjoy any time it's fully acknowledged that philanthropic dollars are in fact up to half public dollars and bear public responsibility. And I appreciated Congressman Becerra making that statement. I wonder if the people on the panel could say anything about how they see the relationship between philanthropy and government in coming years, not just the oversight role that the Congressman spoke about, but the partnership. Do you see it primarily in terms of advocacy? Do you see it a criteria that I don't see here, which would be an interesting one, is often foundations think in terms of leveraging initiatives that can leverage public dollars and turn it into something larger. I wonder if you see that relationship evolving over the next few years.
Obviously I see it from the vantage point of a local not-for-profit in New York. We see it in 2 ways. Obviously, working directly with members of our delegation in Congress and in the state legislature and the city council, helping them draft laws, is something that advocates can do and provide to members of Congress and legislature in a way that's unique, particularly for people who are poor. The second issue is that frontline organizations, particularly grassroots organizations dealing with poor and needy communities in areas of New York, have very little foundation money, by and large. They are government subcontractors, and in this period of contraction, they really don't have the ability to keep their infrastructures together. Clearly, we'd like to start to see foundations taking this area seriously, not just the mega not-for-profits that are dealing with citywide or regional or national issue, but also the ones that are dealing with frontline crises in areas like Bedford-Stuyvesant or the South Bronx or, all across the nation. So just those 2 things I would see, both as a policy supporter for legislators and helping grassroots organizations survive.
Just brief, I think the traditional role, or the more traditional role for philanthropy is to, lift up what works and it gets scaled up and all that kind of stuff. And I think you, on the federal level now, are seeing some examples of that, I think, in the consideration of the expansion of the model of the Harlem Children's Zones that Jeff Canada put together, and Youth Build, which I think is was part of the stimulus package, in the national service proposals, most of which had their genesis in foundation support originally. So that's one thing. The second thing is a foundation that supports a lot of advocacy and increasingly community organizing. I think, for instance, that as the stimulus package moves to the states and there are critical questions about how infrastructure money is spent, that needs to be monitored closely by nonprofit budget analysis groups. It needs to be attended to by citizens organizing groups to make sure that money is fairly spent and goes to its intended beneficiaries. So there's a huge role, I think, for philanthropy kind of in the aftermath of some of the federal action.
Someone from this side. Yes, sir.
I'm Mark Tapscott with the Washington Examiner. I actually have two questions, one for David and one for Aaron. David, you mentioned at the outset of your remarks your desire to see Congress be involved in this in some fashion, and you've spoken very generally about that. I wonder if you could be much more specific in terms of things that you would expect or hope that Congress would do in response to this.
Well, I think it's premature, and essentially what we're asking for, I think Congress is already, obviously, Senator Grassley and others have already raised questions. We would like the Congress, and we're getting copies of this document over to them, to look at this document along with many others that are coming from different sectors as they start to do their evaluation, which is inevitable now going forward. I don't think we certainly don't have a legislative agenda. This is basically a workbook idea to try to see if there can be voluntary action by the foundation sector. But we do want policymakers to also look at these criteria and start taking away from it aspects of it that they can use in evaluating how well the philanthropic sector is doing.
Aaron, presumably, if the philanthropic community starts observing these criteria in a serious way, one would expect in some period of time, I'm sure you would hope relatively quickly, that figure that you mentioned of $1, only $1 of every three going to underserved communities, that would change, that it would perhaps go to, say, $2 of every three. What would then be the funding source for the activities that would no longer be funded if that happened?
It's not so much about not funding those activities anymore as it's about being inclusive of our entire population in how those activities are funded and carried out. So let me give you an example. We talk in the report about what's an arts funder to do. The arts are very important. We acknowledge that and we believe that. What we think is exemplary is when arts funders figure out how to get more disadvantaged and marginalized people engaged in the arts. And that's where we think there can be some creative growth. We're not saying that an arts funder should abandon funding the arts and change their mission and become a social service funder. That would be silly. So, that's really what we're looking for here.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Katie Moore with Washington Grantmakers. Washington Grantmakers is a coalition of about 100 funders in the D.C. region, and it's just one of about 30 regional associations of grantmakers nationwide. What can we do and how can we use our intimate relationships with our core groups of funders to help you get funder buy-in to this very controversial document? I think it's really important. It's very timely, but as you said, it's also very controversial, and I anticipate a lot of even our funders who are very, very engaged will become defensive and justify why they wouldn't do this because they're different types of funders or they fund different types of things. So it's really important that we make sure that we get the grantmaker community's buy-in for this document as we take it to the Hill and really push it forward as our criteria for better grant making.
Thank you for that question and for the offer, I think, that's implicit in helping to do that. I've actually spoken with the head of, I think, almost every regional association of grant makers around the country in the last 6 weeks or so. Shared an advanced draft of the criteria with them and said, let's figure out some ways to partner together. The regional associations often have the